Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. The President of the United States has signed the $2.2 trillion coronavirus package that the Congress has just passed. This is the largest aid bill in the history of the country, of the world, in fact. Will it help the people who need help most? And where is all the money coming from? We'll have details on what's in it just ahead. But first, it has been a very long week. We don't need to tell you that. But on Monday, we told you it would be a long week. Early that morning, the Surgeon General of the United States appeared on television to warn Americans to expect the worst.
I didn't expect that I'd be on the Today Show for such a somber occasion. I want America to understand this week it's going to get bad.
This week it's going to get bad. Sobering words from the country's top doctor. So was he right? How bad was it? This seems like a good time to assess that. In a moment like this, events move bewilderingly fast. It becomes very hard to keep track of where you are relative to where you thought you'd be. Perspective becomes impossible. But tonight, we're going to give it a try because we think it's important. Clear-headedness is always the first casualty of crisis, and that's exactly how bad decisions get made, right in the middle of it. So here are some facts to consider as we move forward. When our show opened Monday night, there were just over 40,000 confirmed cases of coronavirus in the United States. Tonight, at the end of the same week, that number has more than doubled to over 100,000 cases. Over the course of Monday, all day, 141 Americans died from coronavirus. Today, about twice as many died. And that's awful. Every death is awful. It's also a steep and ominous curve. But in absolute numbers, which may or may not be relevant, it is far fewer than many predicted. Most of the deaths have been concentrated, by the way, in a few places: Seattle, Louisiana, and above all, in and around New York. In the city alone, 450 people have died so far. One New York doctor recently described the situation in his hospital as worse than 9/11.
Hell. Biblical. I kid you not. People come in, they get intubated, they die, the cycle repeats.
You overwhelmed?
Yeah, the system's overwhelmed all over the place. 9/11 was nothing compared to this. We were open waiting for patients to come who never came. Okay? Now, they just keep coming.
That was Dr. Steve Casapidis. We're going to speak to him in just a minute on the show. His hospital in Queens seems pretty much completely overwhelmed by this. How is the rest of the country doing? The concern for months has been once large numbers of people started to get sick, our system would collapse. We'd run out of doctors and beds and equipment and drugs, and people who otherwise might have been saved would instead die. That could still happen. It's always something to worry about. But so far, thank God, it has not happened, at least on a large scale in the United States. Doctors and nurses are still working under tremendous stress and at risk to themselves, but still saving people. Even in New York, the scariest predictions have not yet come to pass. And when they seem to have, the truth is, and this is almost always the case about everything, it's turned out to be more complicated than it seemed at first. For example, last night we told you about nurses who donned trash bags because there wasn't sufficient protective gear. A now famous picture of that has been circulating everywhere. It's shocking, but it turns out it's not new. According to a report out of New York, nurses in the city have complained about supply shortages for at least a year. In other words, this is a problem, a bad problem, but it's a long-term problem. We've also worried on this show, along with an awful lot of other people, that there wouldn't be enough ventilators in hospitals, breathing machines, to keep coronavirus patients alive. So far, there have been, instead, more than enough. Last night, we told you the federal government had sent thousands of additional ventilators to New York, many of which remain in warehouses unused. New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo apparently was watching our show last night when we said that, and he didn't want to hear it. His staff called the show last night to complain. But today, Cuomo conceded, in fact, it was true.
Somebody said on one of the cable news shows, the ventilators that New York needed aren't even being deployed. They're in a stockpile. Yes, they're in a stockpile. Because that's where they're supposed to be, because we don't need them yet. We need them for the apex. The apex isn't here, so we're gathering them in the stockpile, so when we need them, they will be there.
Saving ventilators for the apex of the epidemic. We're not going to mock that. It's not crazy, actually. It may be smart, in fact. The question is, when can we expect the apex of the epidemic? And the truth is, we can only guess at that. 3 months ago, no one apart from scientists had heard of this strain of coronavirus. We still know relatively little about it, surprisingly little, really. We can't say with precision how easily it spreads from person to person. We don't know how many people have it in this or any other country. And most important, we're not at all sure how many people in the end will die of it. If the week we just saw is as bad as it gets, we will be fine, essentially. If deaths keep rising at the rate they are rising now, we're in big trouble. That would be a calamity. You could make arguments for either scenario, and deeply informed people are doing just that. The national shutdown we're living through is based in large part on fears the virus could have an overall death rate of 2, 3, or even 4%. That's a devastating rate of fatality. It's high enough to change this country's demographics. But not everybody buys that assumption, again, the assumption upon which a lot of policy has been built. In an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal this week, 2 Stanford medical professors suggested that coronavirus infection may be far more widespread than we thought. Using a series of formulas, they concluded that America may already have millions of cases, active cases of coronavirus. And that would be, paradoxically, very good news. It would mean the virus is far less deadly than we thought it was. If true, total American deaths could wind up in the thousands rather than the millions. Every decent person wants to believe that's the case, and it certainly may be true. The problem is it also maybe won't be true. Outside our country, there is growing evidence that coronavirus is very deadly. Italy, for example, reported 919 coronavirus deaths today. At one point, not long ago, we thought deaths in Italy might be dropping. They may have reached their apex. But they haven't, and they're not dropping. Today was a new record. And it could, in fact, be worse than that thanks to undercounting, which seems to be widespread. In the Italian town of Dalmine, for example, 70 people have died in the last few weeks. Now, officially, only 2 of them had coronavirus, and yet last year, only 18 people total died during the same span of time, and that doesn't seem right statistically. In a town called Bagnatica, 18 people have died in the last month, and yet last year, only 28 people died over 12 months. Is the difference due to coronavirus? We may never know. And that's the problem, and it's why it's so hard for anyone to make wise decisions right now. We're operating with too little information. Informed guessing is essentially the best we can hope for. Many of our leaders, believe it or not, are trying their hardest under these circumstances. Scientists, epidemiologists, doctors, nurses, even occasionally politicians. They want the best for the country, even though they may be reaching different conclusions about how to get there. Others, unfortunately, aren't even trying. They're getting rich manipulating the markets during a crisis. They're plotting to seize political advantages. They're wasting our times giving pompous little lectures about how great they are. Remember their names. They ought to be punished when this is over. Here's someone you should never forget. This is the health commissioner of New York City. She's one of the most criminally incompetent officials in the history of municipal government and public health. As the plague bore down on New York, she told citizens that everything was absolutely fine, and then she urged them to spend more time in crowded public places. Watch this.
The important thing for New Yorkers to know is that in the city currently, their risk is low and our city preparedness is high. There's no risk at this point in time, we're always learning more, about having it be transmitted in casual contact, right? So we're telling New Yorkers, go about your lives, take the subway, go out, enjoy life, but practice everyday precautions.
Right.
That if it were likely to be transmitted casually, we would be seeing a lot more cases.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't get it casually. It's not really contagious. Take the subway. I repeat, take the subway. Can you charge a person like that for stupidity and negligence? You ought to be able to.